No one ever spoke above a whisper in the Thompson estate. The mansion stretched across the hill like a kingdom of glass and marble, its windows glowing through the night, but inside those walls, silence ruled. At the center of that silence was a boy, only 11 years old, fragile, with wide unblinking eyes that had stared at the same plate of untouched food for months. His name was Adrian, the only son of Marcus Thompson, one of the richest men in the country. To the world, Marcus was an empire builder, a man who had turned technology into a fortune so vast that his name alone could move markets. But in his own home, Marcus was powerless. His boy would not eat. His boy would not speak. Every servant had tried. The finest chefs in Europe had been flown in. Therapists from the best institutions in Boston and Geneva had visited. Even doctors whispered in awe at the billionaire's desperation, as if his money should have been able to command biology itself. But nothing worked. Every dish, no matter how carefully prepared, ended the same way, placed on the table, stared at with hollow eyes, and left untouched until it grew cold. At first, Marcus had told himself it was a phase. Children, especially children with Adrian's condition, could be stubborn with food. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Marcus's confidence collapsed. He watched the boy's ribs sharpen against his skin. He watched his son turn away from plates of caviar, gold-encrusted bread, and even the simplest of soups. Each rejection was not only of the food, but of Marcus himself, his fatherhood, his authority, his pride. The servants whispered when they thought Marcus couldn't hear. They said the boy's silence was a curse. That perhaps no amount of wealth could buy a cure for what lived inside Adrian's mind. Some whispered even crueler things, that Marcus, for all his brilliance, had failed the one duty that mattered most. In public, Marcus remained the image of power. He gave speeches about innovation, cut ribbons on new skyscrapers, and was photographed shaking hands with presidents. But when he returned home, all he saw was his son sitting at the long dining table, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the plate before him, refusing to take a single bite. The mansion became a theater of failed attempts. Servants knelt by the boy's side, pleading softly. Chefs presented their creations like artists, whispering about flavors and colors. Doctors tapped charts, explaining that sensory overload might be at play, or trauma, or a neurological barrier science had not yet broken. Marcus nodded at them all, paid their fees, and waited for a miracle. But night after night, he ended up pacing the hallway outside his son's room, listening to the silence stretch on until it seemed to scrape against his bones. There were moments when he thought he saw a flicker in Adrian's eyes, as if the boy wanted to speak, wanted to eat, wanted to cross the invisible barrier that had grown around him. But each time, the flicker dimmed. Marcus told himself he would not cry. Billionaires did not cry. Yet more than once, his face had buried itself in his hands at midnight, shoulders shaking with a grief he never admitted to anyone. By the 6th month, something broke inside the household. Servants began resigning, unable to bear the weight of failure. Therapists stopped returning calls. Even the most expensive chef finally walked out, saying, "Sir, this is not food's fault. It is something deeper." The words stung Marcus worse than any financial loss. And then came the breaking point. One evening, Marcus sat at the table himself, across from Adrian. A plate of bread and fruit rested between them. Marcus pushed it gently toward his son. "Please, Adrian," he whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in years. "Just one bite. For me." But the boy did not move. His eyes, sharp, unreadable, endless, met his father's for a brief moment. And then Adrian turned his face away. Marcus felt something collapse inside him that night. For the first time in his life, he admitted defeat. His empire could build satellites, shape economies, and control futures, but it could not move the hand of his own son toward a piece of bread. It was in that moment of defeat, as servants stood frozen in the background, that a quiet voice cut through the silence. A voice Marcus had not heard before. And it came from a man no one had expected to matter. Why the 2nd month of Adrian's silence, the Thompson mansion no longer felt like a home. It had become a hospital without hope, a palace where wealth purchased only more disappointment. Every morning began the same way, silver trays lined with food carried through the marble halls, chefs whispering prayers that today might be the day. And every morning ended the same way, untouched plates carried back to the kitchen, servants lowering their eyes to avoid Marcus's gaze. Marcus had built his empire on efficiency. His technology could predict markets, optimize factories, and reduce human error to almost nothing. But here, in his own home, logic collapsed. Each attempt at feeding his son felt like throwing stones into the ocean, ripples for a moment, then gone, leaving only silence behind. Doctors became his constant guests. They came armed with charts and scans, theories polished with academic certainty. One explained that Adrian's autism might have triggered sensory rejection, textures, smells, or tastes overwhelming his system. Another spoke about control, that refusing food was Adrian's way of grasping power in a world that frightened him. A third suggested medication, heavy enough to dull resistance. Marcus listened, signed the checks, and waited. Nothing changed. He watched chefs lower themselves to the level of clowns, sculpting animals from bread, turning soup into swirling colors, even shaping chocolate into golden castles. Adrian would stare for a moment, eyes fixed not on the food but through it, as if he saw something none of them could. Then he would turn away. The servants grew restless. They whispered in the hallways, their voices carrying the weight of fear. "The boy will waste away," one muttered. "Even God himself couldn't make him eat," another whispered. And though they lowered their voices when Marcus passed, he heard enough to know doubt was spreading. Inside, Marcus was unraveling. His reputation was built on strength, on the myth that he never bent, never broke. But in the long hours after midnight, pacing the marble floor outside Adrian's room, he felt the cracks widening. He would pause at the door, listening for breath, terrified that one day he would not hear it. In his desperation, Marcus turned harsher. He raised his voice at servants, slammed his hand against the dining table, barked orders like a general in war. But rage could not force a bite of bread past Adrian's lips. Each outburst left Marcus emptier, his anger echoing back to him in the silence of the boy's unchanging stare. One evening, Marcus tried what he had never dared before. He dismissed the servants, sat alone with his son, and pushed a plate across the table. His voice, stripped of authority, trembled like a plea. "Adrian, please. Just one bite. For me. For your father." The boy's eyes lifted for the briefest moment, meeting his father's. Marcus thought, hoped, he saw something flicker there, recognition, emotion, even defiance. But then Adrian turned away, the same silence tightening around them like a noose. Marcus felt his chest collapse. For the first time in years, tears burned his eyes. He had conquered markets, silenced rivals, bent governments to his will. Yet here he was, a billionaire begging a child to take a bite of fruit. His empire meant nothing in the face of his son's refusal. That night, Marcus stood by the window of his study, staring at the city skyline his wealth had built. But the lights that once symbolized victory now mocked him. He realized then that no amount of power could buy what he truly needed. And just when he was ready to surrender to despair, a name reached him, a quiet suggestion, passed from lips that carried no promises but spoke with certainty. "He's not a doctor. Not a therapist. But he has a way with children." Marcus had heard 100 false assurances before. Yet something in those words pierced the fog of his hopelessness. Against all reason, a spark of curiosity stirred in him. And in that fragile spark lay the beginning of everything. By the 7th month, Marcus had stopped counting the failures. The mansion, once alive with noise and movement, had sunk into a kind of paralysis. Footsteps echoed too loudly in the marble halls. Conversations died the moment Adrian entered a room. It was as if the boy's silence had spread like a disease, infecting everything around him. Marcus had long since exhausted the world's supply of doctors, chefs, and therapists. He told himself he would stop wasting money, stop chasing false promises, stop inviting disappointment through the doors of his home. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Not while Adrian's eyes grew hollower with each passing week. And then, when Marcus was at his lowest, a recommendation arrived, delivered not with grandeur, but in a hushed, almost reluctant tone. "There is a man," a long-time acquaintance told him. "Not a doctor. Not a therapist. Not anyone your world would consider an expert. But he has a way. With children. Even children no one else could reach." Marcus almost dismissed it. He had heard too many miraculous claims dissolve into nothing. But something about the way the acquaintance spoke, without exaggeration, without begging to be believed, made him pause. And in that pause, fragile hope was born again. A week later, a new servant was escorted into the mansion. His name was Daniel Hartwell. He was not what anyone expected. Where previous servants had arrived polished and deferential, Daniel stood with a plainness that felt almost defiant. His shirt was simple, his shoes scuffed. His eyes, though, held something unusual. They were calm, steady, unflinching. He did not lower them in submission, nor raise them in challenge. He simply looked, at the mansion, at Marcus, at Adrian, with the quiet patience of a man who had lived long enough to stop pretending. The head servant introduced him briskly, her tone laced with skepticism. "This is Daniel. He has been brought in to assist." She didn't say more, no one expected him to last. Marcus studied him carefully. "You've read the reports?" he asked. "I've read enough," Daniel replied. His voice carried no arrogance, only matter-of-fact certainty. "But I'll need to see the boy myself." The first meeting took place in the dining room, where failure lived like a ghost. Adrian sat in his usual spot, thin shoulders hunched, fingers tapping the table in a rhythmic pattern only he understood. A plate of untouched bread and fruit sat before him, like an offering to a god who never accepted sacrifice. Daniel did not approach with cheer like the others had. He did not kneel or beg or coax with sing-song words. Instead, he quietly pulled out the chair across from Adrian and sat down. Minutes passed. The boy did not look up. The servants exchanged nervous glances. Marcus folded his arms, already preparing himself for disappointment. Then Daniel spoke, not to command, not to persuade, but to tell a story. "You don't have to eat," he said softly. "Not if you don't want to. But this apple," he picked it up from the plate, turning it slowly in his hand. "It reminds me of when I was a boy. My brother and I used to carve them into little boats. We'd race them down the river near our house. He always won. I never figured out how." His words hung in the air, gentle but heavy with something real. He wasn't speaking at the boy, he was speaking as if Adrian already belonged in the memory. For the first time in months, Adrian's fingers stopped tapping. His head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the sound of Daniel's voice. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Daniel set the apple back on the plate, careful and deliberate, as though placing a secret between them. Then he leaned back in his chair and said nothing more. The silence that followed was unlike any before. It wasn't the suffocating silence of failure, nor the cold silence of rejection. It was alive. Waiting. Later, when the dining room was empty and Marcus sat alone in his study, he replayed that tiny moment over and over. The tilt of Adrian's head. The pause in his restless fingers. Small, almost invisible, but undeniable. For the first time in nearly a year, something had shifted. Daniel had not forced, not begged, not demanded. He had simply spoken, about apples, about rivers, about something human and ordinary. And Adrian had listened. Marcus did not say it aloud, but deep inside, he felt a dangerous thought flicker to life. This man might succeed where I, his father, have failed. Next morning, the household braced itself for another cycle of disappointment. Servants moved like ghosts through the halls, carrying trays they knew would come back untouched. But when Daniel entered the dining room, there was something different about the air. He didn't wear the weight of failure the way the others did. He walked in quietly, sat down across from Adrian, and folded his hands like a man with all the time in the world. The boy was already there, shoulders curved, eyes fixed on the plate in front of him. The bread and fruit waited like always, doomed to remain untouched. The servants lingered at the edges, their skepticism sharp in every glance. Marcus himself stood near the doorway, silent but watchful, his face drawn with fatigue. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his tone casual, almost conversational. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think bread was boring. Just bread. Nothing special. But my mother used to tell me it was alive. She said when you cut it open, you could still hear the sound of the oven in its crust, the crackle of fire, the whisper of heat." He picked up the slice gently, as if it were more than food, more than sustenance. "She said eating bread was like eating a story. Wheat from a field. A farmer's hand. A miller's stone. A fire that turned it golden. She said we carried all of them inside us when we ate." The words were not coaxing. They were not orders. They were an invitation into a world that Adrian had never been offered before. The boy's eyes shifted. Slowly. Deliberately. He looked at the bread in Daniel's hand, then at Daniel's face. It was not hunger, not yet, but it was attention. Real attention. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs. He gripped the doorway so tightly his knuckles whitened. Daniel smiled faintly, as if he understood the fragility of the moment. He didn't push further. He simply set the bread down and let the silence breathe again. But the silence was different now. Adrian's fingers no longer tapped the table. His gaze lingered. Tracing the bread, tracing Daniel, as if measuring the weight of the story behind the words. For the first time in months, Marcus felt something stir that was almost unbearable: hope. That evening, Daniel asked permission to walk with Adrian in the garden. Marcus hesitated. Every other servant had failed outside the dining room as surely as inside it. But something in Daniel's calm made him nod. The garden stretched wide, filled with roses imported from Italy, fountains carved by French artisans. But Adrian ignored them all. He walked with his head low, his steps uncertain, until Daniel knelt by a small patch of wild daisies that had pushed stubbornly through the perfectly trimmed lawn. "Do you see these?" Daniel asked quietly. "They weren't planted. They weren't supposed to be here. But they came anyway. Some people call them weeds. I call them survivors." Adrian stopped. For the first time in weeks, he crouched down beside someone. His small hand hovered above the flowers, not touching, just watching. Marcus, following at a distance, nearly staggered at the sight. His son, who had withdrawn from every servant, every doctor, every attempt, was kneeling beside a stranger, sharing space in silence. Daniel didn't move. He let the moment stretch, let the boy's quiet curiosity live without interruption. Then he whispered, "Sometimes, the smallest things survive the hardest storms." Adrian's lips trembled, as if some invisible wall inside him had shifted. He did not speak, not yet, but his eyes glistened with something Marcus hadn't seen in months: life. That night, the household was electric with whispers. Servants who had long stopped believing exchanged startled glances. "The boy looked," one said. "The boy listened," another whispered. And Marcus, though he said nothing, walked through the halls with his chest tight, afraid that even acknowledging it aloud might shatter the fragile progress. He returned to the study late, staring at the city lights, his thoughts a storm. For the first time, he realized the truth: feeding his son was never about food. It was about trust. About connection. Something no wealth could purchase, something he, with all his power, had failed to give. And now, unbelievably, a servant had done what no empire could. Daniel had cracked the silence. And Marcus knew he was standing at the edge of something that would either heal him, or destroy what little faith he had left. By the end of the week, the mansion had split into quiet factions. Some servants began to believe that Daniel's patience might be working, others insisted it was an illusion, that a tilt of the head was not progress, that a boy could not live on attention alone. Marcus stood between these camps like a judge no longer sure of the law. He wanted to believe. He also wanted results, visible, measurable, impossible to deny. The next morning, Daniel arrived with a small linen pouch that clicked softly when he set it on the table. He didn't open it. He simply placed it near Adrian's plate and sat down, palms resting on the edge of the table the way a careful musician sits before a piano. Breakfast was simple: a slice of warm bread, a thin smear of butter, a pear cut into even squares. The kitchen had learned not to overwhelm Adrian with color or smell. The plates came quiet, like the room. "May I show you something?" Daniel asked. He wasn't looking at Marcus. He was speaking to Adrian as if the rest of the world had fallen away. He untied the pouch and tipped it gently. Out slid 3 small wooden shapes, no bigger than the boy's thumb. Boats, carved from apple wood, sanded smooth, each with a tiny triangular sail. Adrian froze. His fingers stopped mid-tap. His eyes fixed first on the boats, then on Daniel's hands, then back again. A faint tremor moved through his shoulders, as if the world had shifted half a degree and he was adjusting to the new gravity. "My brother and I," Daniel said softly, "used to sail these in a dish of water. When one reached the other side, we'd eat the apple slices we used to carve it. We said it was a rule. Boats don't cross alone. They bring something with them." He lifted one boat, set it on the rim of Adrian's plate, and, without touching the food, nudged it so it made a quiet circle around the pear squares. The servants held their breath. Marcus, standing at the doorway, felt the thud of his own heartbeat in his throat. Adrian leaned in. His breath fogged the lacquer of the tiny sail. He didn't touch it. He didn't look away. "Not today," Daniel murmured, and moved the boat back to the linen. "Today is for watching." It was unbearable to Marcus. He was a man who built entire products from prototypes in a week, empires from ideas in a quarter. Watching felt like surrender, like cowardice dressed as wisdom. "He needs calories," Marcus heard himself say, too sharply. Daniel did not look up. "He needs safety," he answered, very quietly. "Calories only stay if safety arrives first." The words stung, and because they were true, they stung more. Marcus folded his arms, a soldier refusing to lower his weapon. Over the next days, a rhythm emerged. No one announced it, but everyone felt it. Mornings were for presence without pressure, Daniel sitting across from Adrian, naming the sounds in the room, the clock's soft tick, the birds stitching a path across the window, the distant hiss of the espresso machine, so the dining room became a map Adrian could trust. Afternoons were for walking, daisies, gravel under shoes, the fountain's steady breath. Evenings carried stories that loosely braided food to memory, bread to ovens, pears to orchards, butter to a cow's patient heartbeat. The stories were never commands. They were doors left ajar. Small things happened, small, but undeniable. Adrian began to slide one boat closer to the pear squares. He examined the butter's surface and, with a fingertip, drew a single line across it, as if testing whether it would draw back in fear. He began to sit before the plate without curling his body away. Once, he lifted a pear square and held it near his mouth, not to eat but to listen, as if food could speak if given silence enough. For the staff, hope became an ache. For Marcus, it became a test he was failing. He wanted to lean in, to help, to do something. Each time he moved, Daniel's calm presence made intervention feel like an earthquake. The more the boy inched toward trust, the more the father felt his own impatience exposed. The collision was inevitable. It came on a rainy evening when thunder rumbled like slow drums behind the glass. The table was set with the now familiar simplicity. The boats rested to the side, the bread was still warm, the butter held a single, unbroken sheen. Adrian sat straighter than usual, his eyes bright in the low light. He lifted the small knife, its edge dull, its handle smooth, and pressed it against the bread. It sank a little. He stopped, breath shallow. Marcus stepped forward. He could not help it. "Good, Adrian," he said, voice tight with hope. "Cut it. That's it. Now. Daniel's palm lifted, gentle but firm. "Let him choose the pace." "He is choosing," Marcus said, hearing the heat rise. "He's ready. We have to move while he's..." Ready for trust, Daniel said. Not for victory. The room seemed to tilt. Servants stared fixedly at a point in the middle distance. The storm pressed its ear to the windows. Adrian lowered the knife. His eyes flicked between the men, registering pressure without. Language. The boats looked suddenly like evidence from a failed experiment. Marcus swallowed the impulse to command and failed. Adrian, he said, softer but still edged, for me. Please. The boy's shoulders pinched inward. The knife went down. The plate became a cliff again, the air too thin for breath. Marcus watched the moment he'd prayed for recede like a shoreline in fog. Nothing broke. No one cried. That was somehow worse. After the room emptied, Daniel remained. He gathered the boats with a care that made them feel like something living. Marcus stayed too, hands on the back of a chair, the posture of a king in an empty court. You think I made it worse, Marcus said at last. I think, Daniel answered, your fear is louder than your voice. Marcus turned, eyes bright with the fury that protects grief. My son is starving. He's starving for control, Daniel said, not unkindly. And for someone whose love doesn't arrive as a deadline. The line landed like a blade placed gently on a table, no threat, just the truth of its edge. Marcus's throat worked. He had argued before presidents with a smile and a statistic. He had never been argued by a sentence. What do you expect of me, he asked, and hated how thin the question sounded. Less, Daniel said. Which is more? Silence rang. The thunder moved farther off. The next day, Daniel changed the ritual. He filled a shallow porcelain bowl with water and set it beside the plate. He placed one boat on the surface. It floated, turning slowly, drawn by currents no one could see. Adrian watched, rapt. After a long time, he reached, steady-fingered, and nudged it toward the far rim. It kissed porcelain and stopped. Rule, Daniel said gently. Boat reaches shore, sailor eats a crumb. He pinched off a piece of bread, no bigger than the nail of his thumb, held it between forefinger and thumb, and did not bring it to Adrian's mouth. He set it in the middle of the plate like a signal fire in a field. Adrian looked at it. Looked at Daniel. Then at Marcus, who, remembering, remained unmoving, a statue learning stillness. The boy lifted his hand, hovered, withdrew. Lifted again. The struggle was visible, like a storm seen from high ground. Tomorrow, Daniel said softly, closing the door on the day before the day could slam it. We let the boat try again. That night, Marcus stood in the doorway of his son's room as Adrian slept. The boy's face had lost its constant flinch. He lay curled around something, one wooden boat, its little sail a triangle of shadow against his pillow. Marcus pressed his forehead to the doorframe. He had never wanted to hold his son more. He had never been more afraid to touch the fragile architecture of peace. In the morning, there would be water in a bowl, and a boat, and a crumb set like a star on white porcelain. In the morning, the mansion would gather its breath. In the morning, a boy would push wood across a small sea and decide whether meaning could carry him where force never could. And the father, finally, would decide whether he could be quiet enough to let it happen. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check Imper. The morning began with rain. Not the violent thunderstorm of a week ago, but a soft drizzle that blurred the windows and turned the garden outside into a watercolor painting. The mansion's usual rhythm carried on, polished shoes clicking against marble, silver trays whispering across tabletops, but beneath it all, there was a hum of expectation. The boy had nudged a boat to shore yesterday. Today, perhaps, he would do more. The dining room felt different when Daniel arrived. He didn't rush. He didn't greet anyone. He simply carried the porcelain bowl, filled it halfway with water, and placed it gently on the table before Adrian. Then, from his pocket, he took the wooden boat the boy had kept beside his pillow and set it on the surface. The little triangle sail leaned, caught a current, and began its slow circle. Marcus watched from the far wall, holding his breath like a man afraid of breaking glass. The servants stayed back, eyes wide, as though proximity alone could ruin the fragile ritual. Daniel spoke softly, his voice low enough that it seemed meant only for Adrian. When my brother's boat reached the far side, he said, we said it carried a message. Not a victory. A message. That someone had made the journey, and it was safe to follow. The boat kissed the porcelain edge and rested there. Daniel pinched a crumb of bread, no larger than yesterday's, and set it at the center of the plate. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the servants. His eyes were only for the boy. Adrian stared at the bread. His fingers hovered in the air, trembled, dropped. His body rocked slightly, the way he did when overwhelmed. Marcus took a half step forward before catching himself, the memory of failure sharp enough to freeze him in place. Daniel leaned back, folding his hands. Not today, he whispered. Today, the boat only carried silence. But Adrian did not look away. His eyes kept returning to the crumb as if something invisible connected him to it. His breathing grew shallow, faster. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, he reached out. His small fingers pinched the bread, lifted it halfway, hovered, dropped again. A ripple of despair went through the room. Marcus's throat burned with the need to speak, to beg, to do something. But Daniel, steady as stone, didn't move. He simply told another story. My brother said the boats were alive. He said when they reached the far side, they whispered back to us, I made it. You can, too. His voice softened further, barely audible. Maybe this one whispers to you now. Adrian's hand twitched. His fingers curled again. The crumb rose, shaking, suspended in the air between boy and plate. He held it near his lips, so close Marcus thought he could feel the distance like a string pulled taut. The boy's jaw clenched. His eyes watered. He hesitated. Then, in a movement so small it might have been missed, Adrian placed the crumb in his mouth. The room froze. It was nothing, just the smallest fragment of bread dissolving on a tongue. And it was everything. For months, the plate had been a battlefield. Now, for the first time, the war had shifted. Marcus's vision blurred. His knees nearly gave out. He pressed his fist to his mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape, a cry, a sob, he wasn't sure which. Daniel didn't celebrate. He didn't clap or cheer or cry. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging a truth that had always been there, waiting to surface. Safe, he whispered. The boat carried you safe. Adrian chewed, swallowed, and for the briefest flicker of a second, his eyes lifted to meet Daniel's. Something passed there, not language, not gesture, but recognition. The boy lowered his gaze again, shoulders shaking faintly from the weight of what he'd done. Marcus stepped forward, but Daniel's hand lifted, stopping him without force, only with certainty. Not yet, Daniel said quietly. Let him keep this moment for himself. The days that followed were filled with echoes of that first crumb. Adrian pushed the boats across the bowl with more confidence. Each time they reached the far side, he allowed a crumb, then a piece, then a slice. Sometimes he faltered, hands trembling, eyes watering, but Daniel never pressed. He simply told another story, of orchards, of rivers, of fields, and always ended with the same whisper, safe. The boy began to eat. Not like other children, not yet, but enough to change the atmosphere of the house. Servants who had walked like mourners now moved with quiet wonder. The kitchen, once a tomb of wasted meals, carried the faint smell of bread and fruit consumed at last. And Marcus, who had stood as a titan in the world, found himself silenced. He watched his son nibble at pieces of pear, butter the edge of bread, sip a spoonful of broth, and he felt awe greater than any he'd felt signing billion-dollar contracts. But awe was laced with something heavier. Because the more Adrian ate, the clearer it became, he was eating not for Marcus, not for wealth, not for obligation. He was eating because of Daniel. Because of the servant's words, patience, and presence. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood what it meant to be humbled, not by rivals, not by markets, but by a man with no fortune, no empire, no title. And though he could not yet admit it, he knew, when his son's first real words came, they would not be for him. It happened on a day so ordinary that no one thought to prepare for miracles. The sky was a flat sheet of pale blue. The fountains breathed in their usual steady rhythm. In the kitchen, butter softened beside the stove, and the bread, now a daily ritual, cooled on the rack with a faint crackle, like polite applause from another room. Adrian arrived at the table without shrinking from it. His shoulders were still narrow, his wrists still delicate, but something in his posture had changed. There was intention now. He looked first at the porcelain bowl, then at the little wooden boat with its triangle of a sail, then at Daniel with a gaze that did not flee. He was not being carried anymore. He had learned to walk across the small sea. Daniel did what he always did, he sat, not opposite authority but beside companionship. He filled the bowl halfway, set the boat gently on the water, and let it wander. No commands. No deadlines. Only a patient current and the quiet room. Marcus hovered at a distance. He had learned, painfully, to be still. Each day since the first crumb, he had practiced silence as if it were a craft, jaw unlocked, hands unclenched, breath deep, presence warm but unassuming. It was the hardest thing he had ever built, a father's restraint. The boat reached the far side with a soft tap. Daniel pinched off a piece of bread, larger than a crumb, smaller than a bite, and set it on the plate. "Messenger," he said, "the ritual's word. It says safe." Adrian looked at the bread, then at his hands, as if checking whether they still belonged to him. He picked up the piece and placed it in his mouth without trembling. The staff at the edges of the room went motionless, trying not to frighten the air. Marcus did not move. He didn't need to. For once, he trusted that love could be a quiet thing. When Adrian swallowed, Daniel did not speak. Instead, he turned his palm up on the table and left it there, open, unthreatening, unclaimed. The boy's gaze fell to that palm and stayed. His breathing quickened, then steadied. His fingers slid forward, paused, retreated, slid forward again, and settled like a bird landing on a branch that had never broken. Marcus closed his eyes. He had not understood, until that moment, that his vision of success had never included the simple dignity of choosing where to place a hand. They sat like that for a long time, the boy's small fingers in Daniel's open palm, the boat turning in lazy circles, the bread cooling on its plate. The house felt different, as if its foundations had shifted half an inch toward mercy. Then, a sound. Barely a sound at first. A scrape in the throat. A rearranging of breath. Daniel didn't look up. He only softened his hand around Adrian's, not to hold, only to be present. Adrian's lips parted. A single syllable tried to lift and fell back, like the boat before it learned the current. He tried again, the way he had learned to try with crumbs and slices and sips. "Sa." Daniel didn't help him. He didn't feed the word or finish it. He waited. "Sa, Faye." It was not clean. It was barely air. But it contained an ocean. A sound escaped Marcus, caught between a sob and a prayer. He clamped it down, not to hide from his own emotion, but to protect his son's. The servants stared at the curtain tassels and the fluted columns and the clock and anything that could keep them from weeping in triumph. Daniel nodded once, not in celebration but in recognition. "Yes," he said. "Safe." Adrian blinked, as if the word had lit a small lamp inside him. He touched the plate with the tips of his fingers, then the bowl, then the little wooden boat. "Sa, Faye," he repeated, steadying the syllables, testing them like steps across a stream. His eyes lifted to Daniel's. Then, to everyone's surprise, they moved past Daniel and found Marcus at the far wall. The room vanished for Marcus. There was only his son looking at him. Not through him. Not away from him. At him. Marcus stepped forward, one cautious pace, then another, as if approaching a deer in winter. "Adrian," he said, and his own voice sounded unused, as if grief had dusted it with ash. The boy tilted his head, the movement that had become a doorway. He touched his chest with a flat palm. Then, with the same hand, he touched the rim of the bowl. Finally, he turned his palm outward in the air, open, offering nothing, asking nothing. Daniel spoke softly, not to intrude but to translate a language Marcus hadn't learned. He's telling you what he needed. A place inside himself. A shore to arrive at. And space to be. The boy's mouth moved. The next word came like a seed splitting under spring water. Not loud. He paused, frowned at the edge of the meaning, and reached for more. Not push. Marcus's hands opened without his permission. The posture of surrender. I was afraid, he said. The confession had never had a room in his house before. I was so afraid. Adrian nodded, a tiny, precise nod, without judgment. He touched his temple with 2 fingers, then his chest. Then he turned his palm up in the middle of the air and left it there, the way Daniel had. An invitation learned and returned. Something broke and healed in Marcus at the same time. He knelt, slowly, mindful of not flooding the moment, and matched his hand, palm up, to his son's, careful to leave an inch of air between them. Adrian bridged the inch himself. The contact was light, not ownership but agreement. He spoke again, halting, each word a boat that needed time to cross. When you loud. I sink. The sentence found its shore. Marcus closed his eyes against the wave of it. All his life he had thought leadership meant volume, decisions announced, timelines enforced, futures commanded into shape. His child had offered him a new definition, the kind that preserves breath. I'm listening, Marcus whispered. Teach me. Adrian's jaw worked as if chewing a hard fruit. He lifted the butter knife, placed it on the bread, and looked to Daniel, not for permission, but for the ritual's word. Messenger, Daniel said, smiling with the softness of a man who had witnessed a bridge build itself. It says safe. Adrian pressed down, carefully, slowly, until the bread yielded. He lifted a slice, not tiny, not huge, perfectly measured to the capacity he had today. He placed it in his mouth and chewed while looking at his father, making sure the lesson traveled the distance between them. When he swallowed, he spoke one more time, the longest thread he had ever pulled from silence. You can be quiet, and still be here. No sentence in any boardroom had ever carried that much authority. It landed not like a reprimand but like a key turned in a door Marcus had kept locked by accident. The servants did not clap. The moment did not want applause. It wanted room. It wanted the kind of quiet that honors what it holds. Marcus nodded, a student receiving instruction. I can, he said. And because he meant it, his voice did not shake. He lowered his hands, opened his stance, and let fatherhood be less like a fortress and more like a harbor. Adrian took another bite, then another, not to please anyone, not to obey, but to answer his own message. I made it. You can, too. He touched the boat with one finger, set it gently spinning, and for the first time since anyone could remember, he smiled. No speeches followed. No proclamations. Only a father learning the vocation of silence, a boy discovering the grammar of safety, and a servant who understood that some victories are measured in the space you agree not to fill. And in that space, the house learned to breathe again. For weeks after the first words, the mansion relearned time. It no longer moved by quarters and deadlines, by investor calendars and embargoed press releases. It moved by bowls of water and small wooden boats, by the sound of bread crackling as it cooled, by the pace of a boy who had found a shore inside himself and was brave enough to visit it each day. Rituals settled like soft rain. Morning met light through the east windows, a porcelain bowl half-filled, and one boat waiting for current. Afternoon meant the garden, daisies stubbornly thriving where they were never planted, gravel announcing each footstep, fountains breathing like a steady lung. Evening meant stories, orchards, fields, ovens, rivers, work in patience and heat, how every meal is a history you choose to carry. Nothing dramatic. Nothing loud. Ordinary things held with reverence until they shone. Adrian kept speaking, not in torrents but in careful streams. Some days his sentences were a handful of stones. Other days they were a string pulled longer than anyone expected. The words were simple, but their meanings were cathedral-sized. Too many smells, he'd say, and the kitchen learned restraint worthy of a sanctuary. Too many eyes, he'd confide, and servants learned to pass like wind instead of weather. Boat first, he would sometimes murmur, and the bowl would appear, and the boat would circle, and the message, safe, would arrive anew. Marcus practiced a new craft, presence without pressure. He learned how to make space and still be here, how to build shelter that does not eclipse the sky. He stood farther back at first, then nearer, until he could sit at the table with his hands open and his voice quiet, a participant rather than a conqueror. He learned that power can be a temperature, and that what he had called love had sometimes been heat too close to the skin. There were setbacks, and no one pretended otherwise. A day when a new jam smelled like a storm and Adrian folded inward. A night when thunder broke the sky and the boy closed his ears and rocked until the rhythm of his own body steadied him again. On those days, the house did not panic. It simply returned to the beginning, bowl, boat, breath, and let the current teach what the mouth could not. Daniel remained the same, a steady hinge on which the new doors swung. He did not collect credit like trophies. He did not let victory grow noisy. He kept his posture of companionship, his stories braided to meaning, his hands open on the table like a map anyone could read. When the staff tried to name him a miracle, he answered with a shake of the head. No, he said gently. He was always here. We only learned the grammar. One afternoon, beneath a sky the color of parchment, Marcus and Adrian stood at the garden's edge where the trimmed lawn surrendered to wild grass. The boy watched a line of ants carry a crumb 3 times the size of their bodies. They don't hurry, Adrian said, voice even. They don't, Marcus agreed. They don't drop, the boy added, eyes following the slow procession. And if they do, Marcus said, they lift it again. Adrian considered this, then nodded, one precise nod that still felt like a sunrise. He reached into his pocket and drew out the smallest boat, its little sail dark with the oils of his fingers. He placed it on the birdbath where water waited, and they watched it spin, not toward any shore, just content to move. Not message, Adrian said, and his father waited, practiced now at patience. Just play. Play, Marcus echoed, tasting a word he hadn't let himself say in years. Yes. In the evenings, the study lost its war room posture. Screens dimmed sooner. The city's teeth, its lights, its signals, its negotiations, no longer demanded tribute from a father who had discovered a richer economy at his own table. The empire did not fall. It softened. It learned what to hold and what to set down. On a quiet night, when the air smelled faintly of rain and the servants had retired to a peace they had not known in months, Marcus found Daniel in the dining room, polishing the little boats with a cloth as if blessing them. You've given us our son, Marcus said. Daniel smiled, not accepting the crown. I've watched you meet him, he corrected kindly. Both of you did the brave part. I don't know how to repay it, Marcus said. You already are, Daniel answered. By guarding the silence that made this possible. They stood like that for a while, 2 men whose lives would never again be measured on the same axis, until footsteps sounded in the hall. Adrian appeared, pajamaed, hair in soft disarray, holding something in both hands. He crossed the room without hesitation and set a plate on the table, a slice of bread, buttered clumsily but generously, and 2 pear squares arranged like small sails. For you, he told Daniel, and then, turning, and for you, to his father. The words landed like gifts that required no return. They ate together. No toasts, no speeches, just 3 pairs of hands, 3 steady breaths, 3 lives touching an ordinary meal until it was holy. Later, as Adrian dozed on the sofa with a boat near his cheek and the house settled into its new heartbeat, Marcus stepped to the window and looked at the city he had once thought was the only story worth telling. He realized that legacy is not measured in towers but in the rooms where a child learns the world is safe enough to enter. He turned back, saw his son sleeping, saw the servant cleaning the table with the care of a craftsman, and finally understood the architecture of mercy, You build it from the inside out, one quiet room at a time. The next morning there would be bread again, and a bowl, and a boat. There would be work, and markets, and meetings. But there would also be a father who knew when to be quiet, a boy who knew where his shore lived, and a man whose words had become bridges instead of commands. And the house, at last, would keep breathing.